Hey guys, I have some important info about the video I need to share before it starts. So, during the process of making this video, I realized that the way I wanted to get images doesn't actually work very well. Or, in the absolute worst case, I could barely find any images at all. So instead of waiting a while to release this list by getting my hands on a DVD, I decided to stay true to my word and get this out on time. So I'll still be releasing 2 of these lists a month. With that though, in this video, each episode segment will have a title card with images on it to create a customized slide about the episode, so there will be something to look at for each episode. But that's really going to be it, and this video is going to be pretty bare bones as far as images go, and there won't be much other editing in the video, so it will be more of an audio experience this time around. Sorry if it isn't that visually appealing, and I hope the content of what I'm saying makes up for it. Also, I hope in the next list I'll be able to get back to normal and just back to what I normally do. But if ever in the future I'm not able to get the images I need to talk about something, this is what I'll do. Alright, on to the video.
Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate!
Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome to another countdown. Today, we're going to be returning to The Simpsons to talk about one of its most beloved seasons. A season I personally love for many reasons. Like I said in my last video, when I briefly mentioned the season 4 backtracked a little bit, and while it still maintained great comedy, it put a bit more focus on fleshing out its stories and characters. Yeah, it's obviously not as story or character driven as something like Season 2, but it still makes a conscious effort to more constantly put focus on that aspect throughout the season while not letting the comedy suffer. But after rewatching the season, I realized it's a lot less story and character driven than I remember it being. It definitely is a bit more than Season 3, but the season isn't too different from how Season 3 went about its episodes. So while I appreciate the effort, because I am a fan of episodes that really put stuff like that into a bigger focus, that's just my personal preference when it comes to the show and TV, I think this push to put the story and characters into more importance shows bigger results later down the road. This season is basically Season 3 Part 2 more than anything, which is not a bad thing to be at all, but I think it still puts its comedy first and foremost, and has the plots and characters really revolve around that most of the time. But don't get me wrong, I think this season is a step up involving how its characters and stories are used, and comedy-wise, it's about equal with Season 3 on that front. But I think Season 4 is the best so far because of its focus on more story elements while still being really funny. It once again is a great step forward for the series, and while I think the season doesn't have as many highs as Seasons 2 or 3, it still is more consistent, and the highs this time are the best they've ever been. For the most part. I bring this all up because I think a lot of people consider this the point where The Simpsons truly become classic and the classic era of Simpsons begins, and one of the best seasons, when really everything from Season 2 has been great, and this season is really close in quality with Season 3. And honestly, I went back and forth on if I think this is the best season so far, because they're so close in quality, and my opinion might change in the future. They both just handle their story and characters a little bit differently, making it a very personal preference thing, which one you think is better. And that goes for me as well. Season 3's episode roster is just so good, and is very close to beating the episode roster of Season 4 out, but personal preference really keeps it from doing so. Heck, That might be a terrible argument, because I think the most story-driven episodes of Season 3 are way more story-driven than anything from Season 4. Figure that out. As I said, I used to think this was a huge step up from Season 3, but now I struggle to pick which is better. I bring this up because I wanted to talk about the popular opinion of the season and its legacy to what I think of the season, and the flavors that it shows off through its episodes, which will really show once I get into this list, compared to the best of the previous 2 seasons. Also, to set this precedent moving forward and take back something I said in my last video. Honestly, rewatching Season 4 and comparing it to Season 3 to write this intro, because it was something I was really thinking of, made me appreciate both seasons so much more for what they try to do, when I don't think I really gave Season 3 as a whole as much of its time of day and a shining enough review when I talked about it in my last Simpsons video, because I was just coming off of Season 2, which I thought personally satisfied me a bit more for how it went about episodes, even if it's nowhere near as good of a season, and being able to compare it to this season like this just made me appreciate both of them so much more. But even with that, this season is a step up in many ways, even if I don't think it's quite a game changer like other people do, but the best episodes are still some of the best yet, so let's get into it. Here is my top 5 best Simpsons Season 4 episodes. This episode is on the list for similar reasons that Flaming Moe's was at number 5 in the last season's list. But I honestly think this episode is much better because this is one of the examples where the bit more fleshed out stories of Season 4 really comes in handy. This is basically an episode about Homer getting a job, but so much happens. Homer getting a snowplow and starting a plowing business is a surprisingly fun concept that leads to a lot of good jokes and interesting scenarios, and the conflict naturally gets added onto that, making it more interesting. What could have just been a pretty fun competition episode between Homer and Barney for who can do the better job plowing, which could have been fun but wouldn't have been that interesting. Instead, I like that this episode sets up why Homer got this plow in the first place, while telling some great jokes around it. The car convention scene is hilarious, and the humor in this episode is top-notch all around. The referential humor and how they use celebrities is some of the best in the show, and they managed to do it all without it feeling forced. And the car convention is the first big example, with Adam West being there, but there are many others throughout the entire thing. But the other thing they do through this is this episode sets up a lot of different aspects beforehand to make this all more interesting. Well, that's the first thing. They also set up how he got his plowing business off the ground and how much he enjoys the fame and appreciation. A lot of the conversations he has during this and both commercials are really funny because of the reasons I already mentioned. And I love how they slowly add Barney to this story, and once they make him a rival, they work their way backwards to give him motivation for why he would be screwing over Homer like this, even if he doesn't really know it, or just doesn't care. This is what gives the episode a little complexity. It tells a decently interesting rivalry story and gives each of the characters motivations, while taking them to some pretty weird scenarios with so many good jokes to count. It does a good job making you like Homer and wanting him to have this success, but at the same time, understanding why Barney might need and deserve this more. and why it's such a good thing for him, which makes the rivalry really interesting. And the episode in general, just a weird experience because you're not always sure how to feel about a given situation. Because once again, while it's a pretty grounded, down-to-earth episode, it goes some weird places, and there's some pretty great set pieces at certain points. And this is really shown off when Homer tricks Barney to go to a dangerous place. You're not sure if you should feel satisfied or bad. This is what makes the episode very unique amongst others in Season 4, and that is what puts it above Flaming Moe's. There is an actual back and forth between the characters, and their motivations are a bit more complex. It's not just one character dealing with the anger and repercussions of another's actions. There's a lot more going on, but it's still simple enough to be easy to get into and tell a lot of jokes, along with going to a lot weirder places while still being very grounded. Yeah, certain things are a bit too simple for my liking. Like, I wish Homer's relationship with Barney and why he wants this success and what it really means to him was a bit more fleshed out. But this is still a fun episode with a great rivalry story and some interesting motivations to make it all so much better. And the ending is hilarious along with all the other great jokes in the episode because of how it plays around with cliches and how fitting it is in the context of this story in a way I can't quite explain. It's a perfect way to end a great episode and a nice start to this list. If there's an episode this season that benefits from additional detail to story the most, it is this episode. What could have been a very generic marriage drama episode, which even at this point would have been really played out, turned out to be a very interesting character study of Marge and her feelings towards Homer through being in this public musical. It does a good job showing off how Homer acts towards Marge, how he really doesn't give off the impression he gives a crap about her or what's going on in her life. The episode doesn't really play this up for laughs either. While they get some comedic mileage out of how annoying some of these conversations are, they play it relatively straight and realistically. They're able to show how hard it is to deal with a husband like Homer without a love triangle or some other huge event being the kicker. I like how far they go with showing just how inconsiderate Homer is and how frustrated they make such a calm and caring person like Marge, and how the musical she takes part in during such a prime example of this shows that off even more. As someone who's been in theater before, I can relate very heavily to so much in this episode regarding the theater aspect. How cheap a community theater production can feel even though it really isn't, and how into it the director gets, especially when the show tries to take itself so seriously, even though some very strange things happen, but we'll get into that in a little bit. The other big thing I can relate to that this episode shows off very well is expressing yourself through performance, which is the main plot device of this episode, at least I feel. How you can represent yourself through the role you're playing in a show and what you're feeling in your personal life at the time, especially when the role starts showing some similarities to your own personal life. And that's what makes this plot super interesting, as we get to see more and more of the way Homer treats Marge poorly in a really interesting way, as she uses that to get more into her role. So not only do we get to see their interesting relationship, but it also shows off how that can affect your performance when you're in a show, which is super relatable to me, as I've already said. And they get a lot of comedy out of this. just the theater experience and how this situation happens and how lazy Homer is, along with him just being super ignorant. Also, just a lot of funny interactions on set, especially from this nut director, and the scenes between Marge and Flanders, which are legitimately kinda nice. Also, just the weirdness of the show itself gets some laughs too. They get a lot of comedy from some much older reference points than other episodes in the season, which definitely gives it a very unique feel. There's also a subplot about Maggie at the daycare, which plays into that a little bit more, and while it's cute and very funny, I do think it could have been cut to develop the story a bit more, at least in my personal opinion, and tell some other jokes around the main plot. But this episode is still great with it, and I love it so much even with that fact, and couldn't really imagine the episode without it. It's just so well done for what it is, and fits alongside the main plot nicely, even if they have nothing to do with each other, because the episode is just that well paced and structured. It feels very quintessential in a way, even though it actually isn't. Anyways, with all that said, the ending to this episode is very satisfying, and we get to finally see Marge's performance and Homer's reaction to it. While I would have liked to see a bit more of this play, and that's another reason why I definitely think the Maggie subplot could have either been cut or toned back a bit, made it a bit less of a focus in the episode. It's still very interesting and hilarious to watch, and we do get to see an amount of it. And the conclusion Homer comes to about this whole situation through the show and Marge's performance is really sweet, and feels in line with Homer's character while giving Marge the satisfaction that she did a good job and he enjoyed the show, proving he cares about her at the very least and is on the right path to treating her better. So in the end, through her performance, she ended up conveying her true feelings to him, which is very impressive and make them both change their perception on each other, and gives her the satisfaction to know she succeeded as an actress. Yeah, he doesn't truly realize his faults and how awful he's really been, and he doesn't completely put two and two together, but he definitely gets a decent idea, and as I said, it's more of him getting put on the road to the right path, which is honestly a much more interesting ending, and leaves it very vague of what would happen next in this situation. It's just an interesting and complex episode with some great humor, especially in the referential area, and I wanted to put it higher because I can really relate to aspects of this plot, but damn, Season 4 did have some classics under its belt, which ended up topping this. Alright, here we go. We have finally reached what might just be the most popular episode of the show. While the last two episodes were really funny, I'll admit they made the list mostly because of story reasons. Not this episode. This episode is here because it's one of the funniest of the show, and most people seem to agree with me on that. While I love the more grounded sense of humor with some referential stuff throughout a lot of this season, and in the other two episodes I mentioned, this much more faster paced joke after joke, not caring about how surreal and weird it comes across, with no sense of groundedness at all, just works perfectly for this episode. This is a true successor, in a sense, to Homer at the Bat, where we have a strange but simple plot, where the episode feels like it has the characters bend to the plot's will and tell as many hilarious and surreal jokes as possible around that. This episode could have come off as all over the place, but just because of how tightly paced it is, and how they cram in joke after joke in, even though a lot of them are really strange, but in the best possible way, it just makes everything hit bullseyes. While I may find Homer at the Bat to be a bit funnier, this episode is still in the same ballpark, and does what it tries to accomplish well. It has a very simple setup which leads to a ton of great jokes, and the episode has such a grand scale to it because of how many jokes it has and how it uses its characters to get the absolute best jokes and for them to play the best role in such a simple plot, from the monorail song to the production of The Thing and the fun ending sequence. It's all just hilarious, and I know I'm repeating myself a bit, and that's because I just don't have that much to say that hasn't been said by a bunch of other people, because this episode's appeal is not hard to understand, and it's loved by so many. So much so that there are a ton of videos breaking down what makes it great, and why its pacing and set of jokes make it one of the best, and unlike some of the other episodes, it just succeeds at being funny all the way through, and everyone who agrees knows it. If I went on, I'd just be listing off jokes and why they work and how the episode uses its plot and its characters and its sense of scope to really bring it all together and make them as funny as they are, but honestly, that'd just be pretty boring. This episode really just speaks for itself, and even though it's not number 1 or number 2, this is the episode I suggest watching the most from this list because it is really a trip and gives you a good sense of what some of the best Simpsons episodes can really be like when they just hit the comedy aspect perfectly. Hell, I'll even add on top of all of that, there's still a very fun mystery aspect to it all, and a great climax with some legitimate tension. Though the plot is pretty much used just to set a very big scope to tell some of the weirdest, wackiest, but funniest jokes of the series, there's still some other interesting things here. So I'll wrap this segment up by saying why this episode isn't any higher. Because unlike Season 3, I don't think Season 4 is at its best when it's funny. Yeah, this is when the show really found its funny bone, and I think this episode is easily one of the best examples of that. But if you've been watching my Simpsons list up until this point, and as I mentioned earlier in this video, you know I really love the show when it's a bit more story or character driven, which the next 2 episodes are some of the best examples of. Also, the fact that Homer at the Bat exists, which has a similar style of humor, but in my opinion, has a bit more funny set of jokes, does keep this one from being as special to me, even if I think this episode might be a bit more impressive than that one, and is a much better example of the show at its peak when it comes to comedy. But also, even if I can acknowledge this is probably the funniest episode of the season, it's not the one I personally laugh at the most. But hey, this is still a beloved classic, and rightfully so. It succeeds at everything it tries to do, and I respect the hell out of it, but sometimes, Season 4 can just do a little bit more. Hey look, a Lisa episode! After giving a Lisa-centric episode the number 1 spot in both my Season 1 and 2 lists, it was very surprising that not a single one made my Season 3 list, and there definitely were contenders. But here you go, the best Lisa-centric episode of the season, and one of the best Lisa-centric episodes in the show, and it only made number 2. But that's for good reason, and I'll discuss that in a little while. But for now, let's talk about why I Love Lisa is one of the best episodes, and why I put it above something like Marge vs. the Monorail. Strap yourself in, because I have a lot more to say about this episode than anything else in this video. Honestly, calling this a Lisa-centric episode is kind of a disservice. While she is a big part of it, this is really Ralph's episode, and his true first appearance with the characterization we know him for today. And that's the first thing I really want to talk about. I love how he is portrayed here, how weird and awkward he is, along with how many jokes they get out of that alone. But because he is the main character of the episode, that's just the vibe the entire thing gives off. I love how they use this awkward vibe to show us weird depictions of Valentine's Day in Springfield. And how, along with telling some pretty funny jokes, it also shows off Ralph's character and why he develops a crush on Lisa. Can I just say, it's so sad that he isn't getting any Valentine's Day cards on Valentine's Day. Like, don't schools mandate that everyone gets one from all the different students? How did the teacher even let this happen? Anyways, I love the scene where Lisa gives him the card. It's a sweet way to set up why, as a dumb kid, Ralph has a crush on her, and the scenes of them together are so awkwardly funny, watching him try to get with her when she clearly doesn't want that. You just feel so bad for this poor kid and want him to stop. Well, you have some of the funniest jokes of the season. Well, this isn't the funniest, it's definitely up there. Some of the highlights include Homer's confrontation with Chief Wiggum, the weird things Ralph does to try to get with Lisa, the "you like stuff" conversation, and the freakout at the Krusty Anniversary show, to name a few. That scene in general is great, because after seeing this weird dynamic play out throughout the episode, with a lot of funny jokes, but just this really awkward tension throughout it all, for it to all culminate with Lisa actually kinda justifiably, but overly cruelly freak out at Ralph on live TV, and the way the episode shows this off is half funny and also incredibly sad in a very weird way. So this episode shows off an interesting character dynamic, while having a nice simple plot that leads to a lot of great scenes, thanks to the many interesting locations and dates this episode takes place on, which I haven't mentioned already, but it takes place on Valentine's Day and President's Day, and gets the best material out of both of those days to flesh out the comedy and simple story even more, and make this dynamic more interesting, because you understand why both these characters feel the way they do about the situation, so you kind of want both of them to get what they want, even if you know that's just not how it's gonna work out. Making an episode with such a simple premise have a little more weight to it all. And while that definitely would have earned it a spot on this list, it definitely wouldn't have been above something like Marge vs. the Monorail. But for me, what really pushes this episode over the edge and landed it this high is the President's Day section. Because not only does it tell some of the best jokes of the series, but it also wraps up this plot beautifully. I've said in this video I can connect to people who try to express what they're going through in real life through their performance, even if it has nothing to do with the actual, performance. And Ralph's performance as George Washington shows this off perfectly. How he looks at the card before performing and throws it into the fire and gives the best damn performance of his life. It's so satisfying to watch him give a great performance in this show he probably shouldn't even be in, as seen earlier in this episode, but surprised the heck out of everyone after being incredibly weird throughout the entire thing and getting humiliated by his crush. It's so awesome for him to show everyone just how cool he really is through this performance. And the fact that you don't see anything about this show beforehand makes it even more surprising. And this scene give him some form of redemption in a way you wouldn't suspect, because in the end of the episode wasn't about his crush on Lisa at all. It was about him. And in the end, this gives us a great look into Ralph's character, with him proving to everyone how awesome he can be, and him and Lisa just being friends in the end. So, in the end, they both get what they wanted, and their views on each other change for the better. And in the end, this episode just wraps up on a perfect note. So yeah, this is just a gem of an episode, and I love it to pieces. It's a bit better than something like Marge versus the Monorail because of those character aspects and how well it takes this simple story but adds some depth to it while still being really funny. It's one of the most interesting episodes of The Simpsons, and I just absolutely adore it. And because of that, I really wanted it to be number one, because it would be a good twist that I don't think any of you would see coming, but that just wasn't the case. Even still, this episode should not have came out as good as it did, with such a simple plot, and making it one of the most impressive episodes of the season because of that. So yeah. Great job, Ralph. You're awesome. And great job, Lisa. Glad to see an episode you're heavily featured in make this list at such a high spot. But once again, it didn't take number one. So what did? But before we figure all that out, here are 8 honorable mentions that just missed the list. This is another strong season of the classic era of The Simpsons, so naturally, there's a list of honorable mentions that are also very strong. But hey, the bar was set pretty high this season. This was a very last-minute decision, but I decided to add this to the honorable mentions due to the fact that this episode does a good job showing off the experiences these characters go through. Yeah, as a story, I think the episode lacks a bit, but the purpose of this episode is to show off these experiences of the last day of school and this awful camp while telling great jokes. Yeah, the story problems, along with this not being the most funny episode, does hold it back a bit. I do think this story is just super underdeveloped, but it does such a good job nailing these experiences down to a T, which is what the episode tries to do in the first place. So, on that fact, I think it succeeds and deserves a mention here. But there are definitely better episodes from the season, and I almost didn't put it in this section. A very interesting story with honestly zero depth, which you would expect an episode like this to have, but it's great because it uses its premise to tell as many jokes as possible, and a majority of them work. On top of this episode being hilarious, it also still has a fun conflict. Even if the story is underdeveloped, and I think they could have taken it to some really interesting places, which was a really missed opportunity, it still makes for a highlight from this season because of just how funny it is. This is probably the best Treehouse of Horror thus far. While it's not scary or remotely creepy at all, and the individual stories aren't the absolute best, it is the funniest one so far, and goes so far with making the jokes really funny. And the fact that it's the family telling these cheesy stories gives the comedy a bit more of an edge, and gives these stories a reason for not really being scary at all, along with making the episode more interesting because of that. A cute little episode that shows a very interesting time of life and has a fun conflict between these two siblings, along with having great jokes and making you feel like you're in those times, like any good flashback episode does. The parents telling the story works wonders for this kind of episode to make this a great flashback episode, and the fact that Lisa and Bart are involved in this story makes their interactions about it and their sections in between when they're telling it more interesting. It also shows how these little experiences during this time of life can have a great effect on the future, which gives such a simple episode about Lisa's first words so much depth. And once again, it's really funny. My favorite being the Walter Mondale reference. As someone from Minnesota, that joke gets me every time. Anyways, this is a very sweet episode that shows off some interesting stuff and was super close to making the list, but I found Mr. Plow just a bit more interesting. A great story with some amazing jokes and very emotional moments due to just how many different great scenes we get out of this story. It does a good job making you care about what's going on through this. Even though Homer obviously isn't going to die, the episode, and especially the ending, are very suspenseful, along with still having great jokes throughout. And yeah, there are certain aspects of this episode that have already been tackled in a certain Season 2 episode, and honestly, a little better there, but this is still a great episode, and that doesn't take away from this episode's greatness at all. A strange little episode that goes to some weird places, but has a very interesting plot revolving around Selma and a ton of great jokes, especially everything involving Duff Gardens. I also like the setup to this episode. It's not the best or anything, but it does a good job setting the mood before hitting you with what this episode is actually gonna be about. The story of this episode could have been really generic, and the subplot has nothing at all to do with the main plot, so both of these things could have been huge detractors for the episode, but they do a great job with both of them, making this one of the most engaging episodes. Yeah, it's still a bit too simple for my liking, and I would be lying if I didn't say I'm not crazy about the subplot, even if I like it, but the main story of this episode is so well done, and is so interesting because of that it takes this episode to some very cool places. The much better Krusty episode of the season that has fun with its setup and the whole Krusty reunion show itself, with a ton of great scenes involving countless celebrities and hilarious jokes in a way that doesn't feel gimmicky. It doesn't do anything absolutely amazing with any of this, but for what it is, it's a great episode with a very fun concept, and its appeal is very easy to understand because of that and get into. But you want to see an episode that is amazing in pretty much every way? Well, we're gonna have to take a look at my I know this is very predictable, and if Marge vs. the Monorail wasn't going to make number 1, then this obviously was. And I know this is my second Simpsons list in a row doing something like this. But just like last time, I feel like the popular consensus on this one is correct. There are people who consider this to be the best episode of the show. And while obviously I don't quite agree, I can totally see why people would call it that. Because damn, is it up there. Why is this episode so great? Well, if you really came into this list asking a question like that, I'll tell you. It's because unlike Marge vs. the Monorail, where I definitely have some very minor personal preference bugs with the episode, this episode just doesn't have any of that. It's one of the funniest episodes of the show. Homer being the union leader and going on strike while facing off against Mr. Burns to get his dental plan back so Lisa can get braces is hilarious. And funny how in over his head Homer is. And how in any other circumstance he really wouldn't care, as shown in the episode. But because of this very specific circumstance, he has to try to get super into it, and how seriously Mr. Burns takes this, which makes it all the more funny and interesting. And that's what makes this episode great. While there are so many funny elements, the actual story is really well done and has some legitimate tension. Homer has a real reason to be fighting this battle when he wouldn't otherwise, and the episode does a good job setting that up and making you care about his struggle and wanting to see him succeed so he can get his daughter braces. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, Mr. Burns is given a reason for why he is being such a stickler about this, making the whole dynamic more interesting. And their interactions with each other and how they view the situation leads to a bunch of amazing jokes. So while the story is interesting because you want to see Homer succeed for Lisa's sake, and as the episode moves forward, you get more and more invested because you feel like these people have been through a lot even when they actually haven't, but you feel like they have, so you don't want them to back down now. But through one of the most engaging episodes of the series because of how they motivate Homer, they still manage to make the whole scenario really dumb and nonsensical. Once again, while it feels like a lot happens, these strikers don't really go through much, at least any real competent challenges. So they balance both the legitimate stakes and deep-rooted conflict with how all over the place and kinda underwhelming the scenario is in a really good way. Even though Homer's motivated, he still has no idea what to do or how to go about this situation. Neither does Mr. Burns, so their conflict ends up being super counterproductive and leading nowhere in such a funny way every time they interact and try to push their agenda or come to a compromise. And it does all this in such a funny way, which makes an already hilarious episode even funnier. But because there's so many interactions between these two characters, and nothing really gets accomplished every time they do interact or cross paths, the stakes somehow feel like they keep getting raised, which adds to the overall story and comedy, like I've already been saying. I cannot commend this episode enough on how it goes about everything, on how it's paced, how it balances all its elements, and shows them off at their absolute best in Season 4. Top that all off with even more hilarious humor and some of the best moments in the entire show. Seriously, every end of this episode, there's one good joke or one amazing moment after the other, making it one of the most memorable episodes of the series as well, including a bunch of referential stuff, and an ending that is so hilarious and awkward, but works because of how weird and strange this episode has been up until that point. And you have, with all of that together, one of the most impressive episodes of the show. I'll wrap this list up by saying it again. Everything about this episode works. Every moment and detail adds something to make it the most complete episode it can possibly be, with too many great moments to count. It's funnier than Marge vs. the Monorail and uses its characters in great ways as well as that episode, but on top of that, its story is so much better than I Love Lisa. And because of that, it just creates the perfect episode and one of the show's absolute best. And in the end, well, I wanted it to be a surprise for what my number one would be. And stuff like Marge vs. the Monorail was pretty close. In the end of the day, it just was never gonna top this amazing episode. And when people try to bring up things this episode does wrong, I just respond with, dude, it's Last Exit to Springfield, the best episode of season 4, hands down. And with that, the list is done. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this different style turned out okay, and the video was still interesting. If you enjoyed this video and want more content similar to this in the future, please leave a like and subscribe. I'm trying to release 2 of these videos a month to make something out of this YouTube channel, so any support would be very motivating. Also, leave a comment down below telling me what you thought of my list. It's interesting to hear feedback and criticisms, as long as they're respectful and informative, always helps. Oh, and also tell me what your own list would have been. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Lastly, a playlist with all the music and remixes I used in this video are in the description, with information about those pieces in the videos in that playlist. All the images and music I used in this video belong to their respected creators. And with that, the top 5 best Hey Arnold Season 2 episodes list will be released around Valentine's Day, and until then, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off.